They say the dead can't speak, that once we're gone, all that's left is what others choose to remember or forget. But I never liked leaving things unfinished, and I won't start now. If you're hearing this, it means the doctors were right. I didn't make it past the spring. This house is quiet now, isn't it? Too quiet. No kettle whistling. No porch creaking. Just the hush of old walls holding their breath. I imagine you're sitting where I used to sit, near the window where the light pools in the morning. Maybe you're holding that chipped teacup I always refused to throw away, and maybe you're wondering why I did what I did, why I changed everything. I heard what they said about me after the will was read. Spiteful, they whispered. She was always dramatic. One of them even said I must have lost my mind. Dementia. That one hurt the most, not because it might be true, I know what's real and what's not, but because it meant they'd rather believe I was sick than consider that maybe, just maybe, I saw them clearly. Finally. So let me be clear now. I changed the will with a steady hand and a steady heart. And before I go, you deserve to hear why. Not from the solicitor, not in legal language, but from me, from my voice. Because I saw who showed up when I had nothing left to give. I saw who still called me grandma when I was no longer useful, no longer hosting dinners, no longer buying gifts or smoothing over hurt feelings. I saw who came not out of duty or inheritance, but out of love. And I saw who didn't. This story isn't about punishment. It's about truth. And I've waited long enough to tell mine. There was a time when this house felt too small. Laughter spilled out of every room, footsteps pounded up the stairs, and I couldn't keep enough juice boxes in the fridge if I tried. Sundays were our day. No matter how busy the week had been, everyone came home on Sundays. The front door would swing open without knocking, and I'd hear, "Mom," or "Grandma," before I even made it to the hallway. The air always smelled like pot roast or baked ham, and the kitchen counter was a mess of mashed potatoes, gravy boats, and half-iced cupcakes the kids helped decorate. They were awful at it, but I left the frosting smudges on their cheeks because it made them laugh. I didn't have much back then, but I had that. I had them. My children grown but still needing a place to land. My grandchildren sticky-fingered and loud and perfect. I was the one who remembered every birthday, every school concert, every scraped knee. I was the one they called when they didn't want their parents to know. I never minded. That's what love looked like to me, being the soft place to fall, even when you were tired, even when they didn't notice how much you gave. And Harold, he was the quiet center of it all. He didn't say much, but he always made sure the driveway was clear when it snowed, that the grandkids had a swing set in the backyard, that I never cooked alone. He built this house with his hands and filled it with warmth. Together, we held it all. The noise, the mess, the memories, like cupped hands holding a flame. But I suppose I didn't notice when the warmth started slipping out through the cracks. When the Sundays grew fewer, and the silence started to stretch between visits. I just kept setting the table just in case. Kept the porch light on a little longer. That's what you do when you love people who forget to love you back. You wait. And I waited. When Harold died, it felt like the walls of this house shifted, not all at once. It was more like the quiet settled differently, more heavily. We'd been married 47 years, long enough that I forgot where he ended, and I began. People said things like, "He had a good life," or "You'll be okay, Lottie." I smiled and nodded, because that's what's expected. But I didn't feel okay. I felt like a door had shut behind me and no one noticed I hadn't followed them out. The children came for the funeral, of course. They helped with the arrangements, stayed for a few days. Everyone said the right things. But even then, I could feel it beginning. The shift. I watched them leave one by one, hugging me too tightly, saying, "Call if you need anything." with eyes already elsewhere. I didn't call. I didn't want to be a burden. I told myself they were grieving too, that they'd come back around. But they didn't. Not really. The phone rang less. Holidays got quieter. My son called on Christmas late in the day, with the kids already halfway out of frame, distracted. My daughter sent flowers on Mother's Day. Pretty, but impersonal. No one asked if I was sleeping or eating, or if I ever went a whole day without speaking out loud. I went from being a center to an afterthought. I started talking to Harold in the evenings, just to fill the space. I'd sit on the porch with his old cardigan wrapped around my shoulders and pretend he was still there. Sometimes I imagined what he'd say if he saw what things had become. He'd probably tell me not to take it personally, that the world moves fast and people mean well but forget easily. But he'd also squeeze my hand, the way he always did when I was hurting, and remind me that I wasn't imagining it. Losing Harold didn't just take my husband. It took the last person who saw me fully. And without him, I started to wonder if anyone else ever really had. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelest part. If they'd slammed a door or shouted something unforgivable, maybe it would have been easier to draw a line. But that's not how you lose people, not family anyway. With family, it's always little things. It's the slow forgetting, the small hesitations, the excuses wrapped in kindness. The first time it stung was my birthday. I had made a little cake. Nothing fancy, just a lemon loaf with some powdered sugar. And I sat by the phone most of the afternoon. When it finally rang, it was the pharmacy reminding me about a refill. That night, I told myself maybe they got busy, maybe they'd call tomorrow, but tomorrow came and went. Then there was the time I bumped into Elaine, my daughter-in-law, at the market. I was excited to see her, I hadn't been out much, and I reached out to hug her. She gave me one of those side hugs, stiff and brief, like she didn't want to be touched. We chatted for a moment, and then she said, in that polite, smiling way of hers, "You know, sometimes you're just a bit much." She laughed when she said it like it was a joke, but it settled somewhere deep, in a place I didn't know could still ache. A bit much. That's what I'd become. And still, I tried. I called. Left messages. Sent birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside. I asked if they needed anything. Offered to babysit even though my hands weren't as steady as they used to be. There was always a reason it wasn't convenient. "This weekend's tricky," they'd say, or "next month might work better." But next month never came. It's funny. I never needed grand gestures, just time. A cup of tea and 20 minutes of conversation. But time, it seemed, was the one thing they could never spare. Not for me. So I started measuring love in absence, in how long it took for them to call, in how many holidays I spent heating up leftovers alone. I'd stare at the front door sometimes, wondering if they'd surprise me, walk in with flowers or news or simply their presence. But the door stayed shut. And I stopped waiting with hope. I waited with resignation. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because the store was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like something's about to go wrong. I was reaching for a can of tomatoes on the top shelf. Shouldn't have been, I know. And I lost my balance. My hip hit the floor hard. For a moment I couldn't move. Just lay there between the soup aisle and the pasta, staring up at the flickering fluorescent lights. People walked by. Some stopped, asked if I was all right. I nodded like a fool, trying not to cry. One kind woman, I think her name was Carol, helped me up, drove me to the ER, stayed with me until the nurse came. A stranger did that. Not my family, and I remember clutching my phone in the hospital bed, debating who to call. My son? My daughter? I stared at their names on the screen. And then I set the phone down. Not because I didn't want to talk to them, but because I didn't know what I'd say if they didn't answer. I couldn't bear the silence. I couldn't risk the voicemail. That night, I told the nurse I'd be fine getting home. Carol, the stranger, offered again to drive me. I let her. When I got back to the house, I stood just inside the door, letting the quiet swallow me. The groceries were still in the car. I left them there. I sat down and cried, not from pain, though there was plenty of that, but from the sharp clarity of it all. No one knew I had fallen. No one noticed I was missing. If Carol hadn't been there, I might have lain on that tile until the store closed. A few days later, I did tell my daughter. She sounded shocked, asked why I didn't call. "I would have come," she said, but her voice was thin with guilt, not conviction. I told her not to worry. I always told them not to worry. But something shifted in me after that fall. It wasn't a decision, not yet. It was just a knowing. A deep, painful knowing that when things got worse, and they would, I'd be facing most of it alone. Not because I didn't have family, but because I'd become invisible to them. That kind of knowing settles into your bones. It doesn't scream, it doesn't rage, it just stays. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that almost tricks you into believing nothing's wrong. I was folding laundry, small things, soft things, when the phone rang. It was my son. Not the youngest, the middle one. The one who used to build birdhouses with Harold in the garage, who once cried when he scraped his knee and asked me if he'd still be brave if it hurt. I answered with a smile in my voice. It had been a while. We talked for a bit. Surface things, the weather, his job. His youngest starting high school, imagine that. I waited for the question behind the call, because after a while you can hear it before it's spoken. And then, as casual as anything, he said, "Hey, Mom, I was just wondering, have you ever thought about putting the house in someone else's name? You know, just in case something happens." I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. My hands were still holding a dish towel, frozen mid-fold. He filled the silence quickly, said it was just about making things simpler down the line, protecting assets. Legal stuff. Sensible, responsible, nothing personal. But I knew. I knew it wasn't about my safety or my peace of mind. It was about convenience, about ownership, about control. Not once did he ask how I was managing. Not once did he mention the fall or the bruises that still hadn't faded. Not once did he ask if I was lonely, if I needed help with the bills, if the nights felt long. He asked about the house. I ended the call politely. Said I'd think about it. Hung up and stared at the quiet again. That evening I sat on the porch and listened to the creak of the swing and the far-off sound of kids playing down the street. And I cried. Not the sharp kind, but the slow kind, the kind that trickles out when your heart is heavy with what can't be undone. That night, for the first time, I pulled out the drawer where Harold used to keep the important papers. The deed. The insurance. The will. I didn't change anything then. I just looked. But something in me had started to turn, and it would not be turned back. It wasn't a dramatic entrance, no big moment, no swelling music or teary reunions. They just showed up. One after the other, on days when I didn't expect the doorbell to ring. My grandson Daniel started coming by on Wednesdays, brought groceries the first time, said he was already out running errands. But I knew better. He'd remembered I mentioned how heavy the bags felt lately. My granddaughter, Elsie, dropped in a week later with a container of soup and a pile of laundry she said she could fold here so we could talk. We barely touched the clothes. At first, I told myself it was coincidence, that maybe their parents had asked them to check in, but it kept happening. Daniel fixed the wobbly banister without being asked. Elsie brought my prescriptions before I even realized I was running low. They never stayed too long, never made it feel like a chore. But they always stayed long enough to listen, Not just to my stories, but to the silence, too. That silence I carried like a second skin. They didn't fill it with noise. They honored it. One afternoon, I mentioned how hard it was to sleep lately, how the nights dragged longer than they used to. The next day, Elsie arrived with a little clock that played soft rain sounds and a book of poetry she thought I might like. She didn't ask if it would help. She just placed it on my nightstand and smiled. I sat with that gesture longer than I'd ever sat with any birthday card in the last decade. They didn't talk about the house. Never once asked about money or paperwork or plans. They didn't treat me like I was fading, or fragile, or halfway gone. They treated me like I was still here, still worth something. And the thing that humbled me most, they had their own lives. College, part-time jobs, friends, dreams, heartbreaks I only glimpsed in the way their eyes looked some days. They weren't free. They made space. That's what love looks like, isn't it? Not obligation, not guilt, just presence. Chosen, deliberate presence. And somewhere in those quiet afternoons and unexpected laughter, I realized something. It wasn't that I'd been abandoned by everyone. It was that the ones who mattered most were already here. They came not because they had to. They came anyway. The diagnosis came in early spring. I remember the way the doctor said the word, like he was offering me something wrapped in gauze. Terminal. He spoke gently, with that practiced calm that's supposed to soften the blow, but the word landed like a stone in my chest. I sat there nodding, feeling my hands go cold, hearing only pieces. 6 months, maybe less. Comfort measures. Prepare. I walked out into the parking lot and stood in the sun, blinking at the brightness, wondering how the world could look so normal when mine had just cracked in half. I didn't tell the children right away. I needed a few days to gather myself, to decide how I wanted the end to begin. When I finally did, the responses came slowly. My daughter replied with a long text, too long, too careful, filled with phrases like, "So sorry to hear," and "thinking of you." My eldest son called, but the conversation was stiff, awkward. He asked about doctors and next steps like it was a business transaction. The youngest didn't respond at all, but Daniel was there the next day. No dramatics, no grand gestures, just a quiet knock on the door and his arms full of groceries. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He said, "I brought you the good peaches." And then he sat with me while I cried, holding my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Elsie came that weekend with a notebook already full of appointments and notes. "We'll keep track of everything," she said, flipping to a page where she'd drawn up a medication schedule. She wasn't playing pretend. She was ready. When the pain got worse, she learned how to measure the drops, how to rub my back in just the right way that eased the tension. She never flinched, never rushed. She was only 23, and somehow she became my anchor. They were both so young. And yet they carried me with a strength that humbled me. They made meals, changed sheets, argued gently with nurses who didn't listen closely enough. Not once did they ask how much longer I had. They lived with me in the moments, in the in-betweens. They found ways to bring laughter into the house again. Not the loud kind, but the tender kind that bubbles up when someone truly sees you. That year was hard. My body weakened, my world narrowed, and the silence from my children grew louder. But Daniel and Elsie, they stayed. Through everything. Through the worst of it. And because they stayed, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I mattered still. I didn't wake up one day and decide to change the will out of anger. There was no dramatic scene, no slammed door, no letter torn in two. It was a decision that unfolded slowly, like leaves curling in autumn. Quiet, inevitable. I sat at the kitchen table one morning, the same place where I used to butter toast for Harold, and I thought about what I had left to give. Not just the house or the savings, but the pieces of myself, the legacy of my time, my care, my presence. The lawyer was kind, older than I expected, with eyes that didn't look surprised when I told him what I wanted. I remember him asking gently, "Are you sure?" I nodded. Not because I didn't love my children, I do, in a way that's hard to explain now, but because love alone isn't always enough. I loved them through every disappointment, every missed holiday, every polite phone call that ended too quickly. But love doesn't erase absence. It doesn't mend what's been ignored for years. I told him exactly how I wanted it to read. The house would go to Daniel and Elsie. The modest savings split between them. The few heirlooms I'd kept, Harold's watch, my wedding band, the family Bible, they'd know what to do with those. The others would get letters. Not cruel ones, just the truth. A record of who I saw when my world got small, who reached back when I could no longer reach far. People say decisions like that come from bitterness, but I've learned that bitterness is what settles in when you pretend nothing's wrong. What I felt was clarity, a calm kind of certainty that comes when you stop hoping for a different past. This wasn't about taking something away. It was about giving what little I had left to the ones who had already given me so much. I knew they'd talk, that the rumors would come, that someone would suggest I was confused or manipulated or simply unwell. But they weren't here. They didn't see the day Daniel sat beside me on the bathroom floor after I collapsed, or the night Elsie changed my sheets in the dark without waking me. They didn't see the love in the quiet acts, the love that didn't ask for anything in return. This wasn't a mistake. It was the most lucid choice I've made in years, a choice made with open eyes and a full heart. I've turned it over in my mind more times than I can count. What might have changed if just one of them had asked the right question? Not a grand apology or some teary confession, just something small and human. "Are you lonely, Mom?" That would have been enough. Even once, even whispered. Instead, our conversations were built on politeness, like carefully stacked teacups no one wanted to tip. "How are you?" "Fine." "Busy these days?" "You know how it is." I said all the right things because I didn't want to sound needy, and they responded with just enough warmth to convince themselves they hadn't left me behind. I remember a time, years ago, when my youngest used to call me every Sunday without fail. We'd talk about the news, about books, about the birds in the backyard. Slowly, those calls dwindled. First they moved to every other week, then just holidays, and then not at all unless I reached out first. And when I did, I'd always get that slight pause, the one that said, "I wasn't planning on this." I'd hear it in their voice like a sigh trying to be hidden. I didn't need gifts. I didn't need praise. I just needed to be seen. And instead, I became something they managed. A check-in, a task, a holiday card with a printed signature. I would have forgiven anything. The missed birthdays, the forgotten anniversaries, the silent illnesses. If just once they'd looked me in the eyes and asked if I was okay. It's not that I believe they're bad people. They have families, jobs, lives that fill up faster than they can manage. But love doesn't disappear just because life gets busy. Love makes space. Even a phone call, even 10 minutes, can remind someone they still matter. Sometimes, late at night, I'd picture them sitting across from me asking, "What do you need, Mom?" And I'd imagine myself telling them the truth, that I needed to feel like I wasn't invisible, that I needed to believe I was still loved, not out of history, but out of presence. But they never asked. And so I learned to stop needing what would never come. My last birthday was quiet, but not empty. I wasn't expecting anything. I've long since stopped circling dates on the calendar. But when I opened the front door that morning, there was Daniel standing there with a cake he'd baked himself. The frosting was uneven, and the writing was a little shaky, but when he placed it in front of me, I felt more celebrated than I had in years. He didn't ask if I liked it. He just sat with me while we ate, smiling with the kind of gentleness that doesn't demand anything in return. Later that day, Elsie arrived with a blanket she had crocheted herself. I recognized some of the colors, yarn I'd tucked away in a drawer for years, thinking I might use it again someday. She had found it somehow and turned it into something warm, something beautiful. "It's for the porch," she said, "so you don't get cold in the evenings." She wrapped it around my shoulders like it was armor. We didn't say much after that. We just sat. The silence between us wasn't heavy. It was full. They gave me more than I ever asked for. They gave me time. They gave me patience. They gave me presence. And not once did they ask for anything in return. That's the thing about real love. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't need reminders. It shows up, quietly, again and again, without fanfare. They didn't fix me. They didn't try. They just made room for me to be exactly who I was. Fading, frail, but still here. I think about how different it might have all felt if this was the love I'd received all along, not the kind that appears when you're useful, when you're needed, when you're still strong enough to carry a casserole up the stairs, but the kind that stays when you have nothing left to offer but your company. That's the love that endures. In their eyes, I wasn't forgotten. I wasn't burdensome. I wasn't too much. I was just their grandmother. That was enough. More than enough. And that day, with the crooked cake and the handmade blanket, I knew without question that I'd made the right choice. Not out of vengeance, not out of bitterness, but out of deep, steady gratitude. Because what they gave me wasn't just comfort. It was dignity. By the time you hear this, the papers will have already been sorted. The will read. The keys passed on. The rooms emptied of what can be boxed and labeled. There may be questions. There may be anger. That's all right. People often mistake grief for injustice when what they're really mourning is their own absence. But I didn't leave this behind to stir conflict. I left it because I didn't want the only thing you received from me to be a signature on a legal document, a transfer of title, a list of possessions. That was never the point. The house was never just a house. It was the place where you showed up, over and over, when I was too tired to speak. It was where you learned to listen without rushing, to love without needing something in return. You gave me back pieces of myself I didn't realize I'd lost. So if anyone ever tells you I made a mistake, you can let them believe that. You don't owe them a defense. The will wasn't the message. This is, I saw you. I saw the way you carried my burdens without flinching. I saw the way you filled the silences, not with noise, but with presence. I saw your kindness, your resilience, your unspoken loyalty. I saw love, not the kind born from tradition or duty, but the kind chosen in the small, quiet spaces where it matters most. What I've left behind isn't wealth. It's something steadier, a place that remembers you, a space you've already filled with your care, your laughter, your late-night visits and early morning kindnesses. The home is yours, not because I gave it to you, but because you've already made it your own, in ways no one else ever tried. And if there's one thing I want you to carry forward, it's this. Love, real love, is presence. It's showing up when it's hard, when it's inconvenient, when there's nothing to gain. That is what you gave me. That is what you carry now. Live in this home knowing you were seen, deeply and truly, and that in my final days, I felt loved because of you.